Hi and welcome to my true crime channel. My name is Anzo, and today I want to talk about a case that I think is one of the more famous, if not the most famous French true crime cases, which is of course the case of Blanche Monnier. But wait, before you go clicking out of this video thinking you already know what happened, I'm not actually so sure you do. Now let me explain. So the reason why most people have it wrong with this case is because of a French writer called André Gide, who wrote a book called Judge Not in 1930. And basically this book was a collection of true crime cases, and among others, Blanche Monnier's story was covered in a chapter called The Confined Woman of Poitiers. I am, by the way, very sorry about my atrocious pronunciation. French is extremely difficult for me to pronounce. English, Finnish, both fine. Swedish, meh. But French, it's just, I don't know, my mouth just doesn't do the things that it should. I'm sorry. But anyway, so Guidin's version of events is what has inspired the current version of the story, but French historians have since studied Guidin's writing, and they have debunked a lot of what he wrote, claiming that when he researched the case, he had misinterpreted news articles and used the town gossip as facts. But for the sake of transparency, I will tell you both versions in this video, and you can decide for yourself which version seems most plausible to you. Also, this is probably a good time to tell you that this video deals with mental health issues, mental health problems, and eating disorders. So if you are bothered by those topics, this is probably not a good thing to watch. On March 22nd, 1901, the public prosecutor of the French city of Poitiers received an anonymous letter making some chilling claims. The letter said that there was a woman locked inside a room in Madame Monnier's house and that she lived in absolutely deplorable conditions and on the verge of starvation. The writer added that this had been going on for 25 years and that the woman was actually Madame Monnier's daughter and needed help urgently. The prosecutor was bewildered by the letter, as Madame Monnier was a respected older woman in the community. She belonged to a wealthy and well-known noble family and lived in a lavish either 2- or 3-story house, I'm not sure about that, on Rue de la Visitation, nowadays known as Rue Arthur Rank. As wealthier people did those days, she also employed a number of nurses and servants to manage her needs and affairs. So how was it possible that this could have been going on for all those years, 25 years, and was kept a secret? The public prosecutor was shocked by the allegations and decided to send a police chief to interview Madame Monnier and to check on her daughter's condition the following day. The next day, at around 2 p.m., a police chief, along with 3 of his constables, arrived at Madame Monnier's house, and they examined the house from outside and noticed that one of the windows on the second floor was chained shut, and they wondered immediately if that was the room mentioned in the letter. They proceeded to knock on the door and informed the housekeeper that they had come to see Madame Monnier, but they were told that she was in extremely poor health and therefore unable to receive guests. The police chief didn't give up though and said that the matter was urgent and serious and asked the housekeeper to go tell her mistress who they were. When the housekeeper returned, she said that Madame Monnier was truly in no condition to receive the police, but that they were welcome to go to the house on the opposite side of the street where they could talk to her son, Marcel Monnier. When the police knocked on Marcel's door, it was opened by another housekeeper who said that Marcel was also unable to receive guests. But the police chief didn't give up and asked the housekeeper to go let Marcel know who they were, and this worked, and Marcel agreed to speak with them. The police chief told Marcel about the anonymous letter and the serious allegations about his mother and asked him to let them into his mother's house to check up on his sister. Marcel, however, he wasn't having any of it. He became extremely agitated and told the police chief that the allegations were absolutely not true, and he was very offended that people would say such horrific things about his family, but he did go on to say that he didn't have any personal involvement with his sister's situation. His sister and his mother lived in a separate building from him, and his mother took care of his sister, and whatever was going on in their house was really none of his business. In response, the police chief told him that the best way to prove the allegations were wrong was to let him and his constables to check on his sister, basically saying that if nothing was wrong, they shouldn't have anything to hide. Marcel did try to weasel his way out of the situation, saying that he could not let the police into his sister's room before he had talked to her doctor about it, and he also said that his sister had been suffering from something called a severe fever for the past 10 years. And to me, this sounds like a crazy diagnosis. I don't know if this was a thing back then, some diagnosis back then, but to me, as a nurse, it sounds like someone's had high temperature for 10 years, which is just, I don't know, can that happen? I don't know. But anyway, Marcel said that this condition made her weak and that she wasn't always able to receive guests. He also said that he visited his sister twice a week and that he could prove that she had not been mistreated or isolated in any way, let alone locked inside her room. The police chief did not back down, and I bet to him, just like to me and to most of you watching this, he was acting very suspiciously. Finally, Marcel agreed, but he said that he would need to ask his mother's permission, and after a long conversation with her son, Madame Monnier agreed to let the police in. As the police entered the house, they thought that everything seemed normal. They checked every room on the main floor, and finding nothing out of the ordinary, they decided to move on to the second floor. As soon as they started to climb the stairs, they started to notice a foul, nauseating smell that seemed to get worse the further up the stairs they went. At the top of the stairs, the smell had become so horrible it made the police retch and gag, and some of them felt physically ill. They looked around and realized that the smell was coming from one of the bedrooms, and at this point I actually want to note that many English articles have claimed that the room was locked, but the French articles have specifically stated that this was not true. That the room window, which the police officers noticed from the street, that was chained shut, but the door wasn't. The police entered the room, and now the smell was so pungent and overpowering that they were struggling to breathe. They later stated that they had never smelled anything so awful in their lives, and one of the constables even fainted. That's how disgusting it was. Since the only window in the room was shut and there was no other light source, it was really hard to see what was inside the room that made it smell so bad. They tried to open the window, but it was shut so tightly that they ended up having to remove it from the hinges, and when the room was finally flooded with light and fresh air, they were able to see what was in the room, and what they saw was truly horrific. A French newspaper article written at the time described what the police officers saw, and I will tell you what this article said, but I want you to keep in mind that this translation has been done with Google Translator, so it's obviously can have mistakes. So the article read, quote, "When light came into the room, we saw a bed at the back of the room with very thin, naked woman lying on top of a rotten straw mattress. The woman's hair was uncombed and had grown very long over the years. The woman looked scared and tried to hide under a blanket. The mattress and bed were covered in hardened feces, and there were rotten food items such as pieces of meat, fish, and oysters scattered around the room. The mattress was teeming with bugs, fat larvae, and rats. The woman was as thin as a skeleton. Her thighs were the size of a healthy man's wrists, her arms as thin as the neck of a bottle, and her fingers as thin as pencil. Her nails were uncut and had grown very long. Her hair was unbrushed and unwashed and formed a single clump resembling a matted horsetail. The poor woman was lying in the middle of a hardened stool mass and rotten fruit droppings that had accumulated around her on the bed." End quote. So the woman in the room was Blanche Monnier, the daughter of Madame Monnier, who had seemingly disappeared without a trace 25 years earlier when she was only 25 years old. She was visibly scared and confused, and according to the police, was shouting words at them that none of them could understand. To them, it sounded like gibberish. When the police tried to remove her from the mattress, she tried to resist, but because she was in such a frail condition, that didn't really do much. And she was wrapped in a blanket and placed into an ambulance and transported to the nearest hospital. When Blanche arrived to the hospital, she was washed and weighed for the first time in a very long time, it seemed. Her hair was a meter-long tangled mess, riddled with bugs, feces, and other kinds of dirt, and it had to be completely cut off. For some reason, they decided to see how much the hair weighed, and you can just imagine how much dirt was in the hair because it weighed 2.5 kilos, which is a little over 5 pounds. Blanche herself weighed 25 kilos, which is 55 pounds, and was literally on the verge of starvation. The nurses who bathed and took care of her were later interviewed by the police, and they reported that Blanche had enjoyed being washed and had even said how wonderful it felt. She had also admired the sky and said how much she enjoyed the light. Blanche ended up staying in the hospital, and her nurses reported that she was calm and obedient, but that the 25 years she had spent in the darkness of her room had seriously damaged her mental health, and that they believed that she would never really recover. Despite this, she did improve a little bit during her time in the hospital. She ate what she was given and did what was asked of her, and slowly but surely she started to gain weight and strength and was able to do some things independently. The police suspected that Blanche had been held captive by her mother all those years, and Madame Monnier was arrested on May 24th, the day after Blanche was found. Marcel was also arrested the same day, mainly because he had been so hesitant to let the police check up on his sister, and that's why the police believed he had also been involved in his sister's maltreatment. Obviously, this was huge news at the time, and to be honest, it would be huge news now as well. In fact, didn't something like this happen in Texas recently? I seem to remember that a woman was confined to a sofa for years, and I think the coroner estimated that she sat on her parents' sofa for 12 years and developed ulcers that got infected, and then those developed into sepsis, and that's why she died. Horrible fate. But it just goes to show that this is not just, something that happened back then, can happen these days as well. So just like in that case, when people found out about Blanche's horrible living conditions and how malnourished she was, they were furious. And from then on, a group of angry citizens started gathering outside of Monnier's house every day to demand punishment for her. How cruel must this mother have been to treat her daughter like this? It seemed that for the past 25 years, Madame Monnier had tortured her daughter to the point of losing her mind, almost killing her. The people were understandably pissed off, and for a long time, this was the only thing people talked about. They wondered what could make a mother do this to her child, and of course, all kinds of rumors started circulating about what might have caused this. Some wondered if she had fallen in love with a man that the family didn't approve of, and that maybe she had even become pregnant outside of wedlock, and that the family wanted to hide it to avoid shame and stigma associated with having children out of wedlock. A newspaper article at the time wrote that the most widely believed rumor was that when Blanche was just 25, she had met a penniless lawyer who she had wanted to marry, but that her mother was against the union, believing that this man was beneath Blanche, and to prevent them from marrying, Madame Monnier had locked her daughter in her bedroom and had never let her out, no matter how much Blanche had begged for her release. Although these rumors were printed at the time, the newspaper articles specifically stated that these were just rumors and were based on town gossip, and the truth of what had happened was actually unknown. André Guérin, the author I mentioned previously, had apparently used these newspaper articles as sources for his writing and had believed the rumors to be true. So this is probably why almost all the English sources retell this story, but the French articles I was able to find tell a very different story. So next I'm going to tell you what the French historians believe to have happened, and it goes something like this. Blanche's father, Charles-Émile Monnier, was born in 1820. He married Louise Léonide de Marconnay, who was born in 1825, so she was 5 years younger than him. They married in 1847 when Louise was 22 and Charles-Émile 27, and a year after, they gave birth to a son, Marcel. 2 years later, in 1848, they had a daughter, Blanche. Blanche's mother, Louise, was not a very likable woman, and according to French historians, she was a greedy, irritable, and anxious person who didn't care for personal hygiene. According to her maids, she didn't bathe and wore the same dirty dress day after day and rarely left the house. Blanche's father was described as Louise's opposite. He was a teacher by profession and eventually advanced in his career to become Dean of University of Arts of Poitiers, where he remained in office until 1879. He was also said to be a kind-hearted man, but weak in character, who let his wife run their household as she pleased. Blanche and her mother had a very difficult relationship, and it got worse when Blanche started to show signs of mental illness. Louise got frustrated with her daughter whenever she behaved in undesirable ways and thought that punishing her for it would make her behave differently. Louise herself told the police that when Blanche was a young girl, she got very ill with fever and never truly recovered from that. So I'm wondering if this is what Marcel said earlier, that she got severe fever and has been ill ever since. I don't know. After the sickness, Louise noticed that Blanche had lost her appetite and started to also behave in ways that was considered inappropriate at the time and also brought shame to the family. I mean, to be honest, I think the way she behaved would be also considered inappropriate in our time. So, yeah. According to one of the articles, Blanche was already remarkably skinny as a teenager, but at the time did well in school and was very religious. And according to Louise, she was a bit of a loner, not really interested in socializing, and one of her favorite things to do was actually going to church. And for a while, Blanche had even entertained the idea of becoming a nun and apparently visited a local convent to talk about the possibility of studying there. She was ultimately told that she was too thin and looked unhealthy, but that if she would get better, they would consider having her. I know that a lot of English sources say that Blanche was a remarkably beautiful young woman who, because of her beauty, attracted the attention of several men. But during her interrogation, Louise said that Blanche had never shown any interest in getting married. As I mentioned earlier, Louise and Blanche had a very difficult relationship, but Blanche and her father got along much better. He, of course, was also very worried about his daughter's health, especially when her mental health problems worsened and she started to act in a way that caused the family shame. In 1876, a doctor was called to see Blanche, and after a thorough examination, the doctor stated that it was clear that Blanche could no longer take care of herself. At this point, she only wore dirty clothes and didn't want her room to be cleaned. And on top of this, she made a habit of running around in the back garden wearing only her undershirt, so basically naked from the waist down. The Monnier house was on a busy street that Charles Emil's students used to walk to school. So every day they would walk past their house, and pretty soon they started to notice something odd. Blanche's room was on the main floor, and her bedroom window was overlooking the street, making it easy for anyone to look inside and see what she was doing. At this point, Blanche had started to spend more and more time in her bedroom, complaining about constant tiredness, and I'm guessing she was quite thin at this point because she also complained that wearing clothes made her even more exhausted. And she had a habit of walking around her bedroom naked, and of course, this drew the attention of people passing by. Pretty soon, a small crowd would gather around her window every day to see what she was doing and to speculate what caused this kind of odd behavior. And this didn't seem to bother Blanche at all, but her family was mortified, and they tried different methods to get her to behave differently, but nothing worked. Blanche's father was extremely upset by this unwanted attention and decided to lock the window of Blanche's bedroom. And I guess he felt that if he couldn't make his daughter behave better, then at least he could ensure some privacy. The family's servants later recalled that around this time, Blanche started also having severe fits of rage that would make her throw stuff and yell horrible, horrible things to people around her. They also had a housekeeper, a woman called Faisy, who had been with the family for many, many years at this point, and she was actually the only person who had the ability to calm Blanche down when she was having these fits. Over time, Blanche's behavior continued to worsen, and the family did their best to hide her from others. Eventually, they asked a doctor to come and look at her again, and this time the doctor felt they knew what was going on with her. Blanche was diagnosed with having early dementia, which we today call schizophrenia. But unlike today, though, there wasn't any medication or any kind of treatment for it, and Blanche was placed in a nursing home. She stayed there for a short period of time, but then Blanche's mother thought that, okay, we can definitely take equally good care of her at home, and Blanche was brought back to live with her family. Blanche's father died in 1882, which led to a sharp decline in Blanche's mental health. The next 2 years, she lost a significant amount of weight, but was still well enough to attend her brother's wedding in 1884. After the wedding, though, she returned home and locked herself inside her room, so basically the last time she was seen outside of the house was at her brother's wedding. At this point, her bedroom must have already been on the second floor of the house, because from then on she refused to get out of bed and stayed there until she was found 25 years later. At first, people must have thought that this is just a phase, but as years went by and she showed no signs of improvement, they lost all hope. And I think it's also good to remember at this point that mental health, like the understanding of mental health that we have these days, it definitely wasn't like that 100 years ago, not even 50 years ago. So, you know, these people didn't know anything about it. And oftentimes if people had mental health issues, it was thought of as some sort of a personal failing or bad discipline or something like that. When Blanche's favorite caregiver, Faisy, died in 1886, Louise Monnier hired several young nurses to help with Blanche's care. Many of these new recruits didn't stay for long, though, and those who did, well, they didn't know at all how to care for her. Blanche stayed in her bed and soon didn't even allow anyone to touch her and was very selective with the food she ate. Her mother tried desperately to get her to eat anything, and she brought her favorite foods like oysters, And I guess she ate a little bit here and there because she stayed alive all those years. But at this point, you can probably start seeing how things escalated to the point they did. It was obvious that Blanche was suffering, but as there was no treatment available, the people around her did what they could. She would often be heard crying about her fate, but couldn't be helped, and of course she couldn't help herself. I don't know exactly why she was allowed to live in her filth and why her room wasn't cleaned properly, but that's how it was, and that's how she lived up until she was found by the police. Now, you're probably wondering who reported all of this to the police. Well, this happened because one of the housekeepers invited a young soldier into the house when Louise Monnier was sleeping. This wasn't obviously allowed, but at this point, Louise was quite ill and hadn't left her bed for a while, so I guess the housekeeper felt it was kind of safe to sneak him in. The soldier found out about Blanche, and maybe the housekeeper even let him peek inside the room because this was so shocking to him that he felt he had to report it. And the next day he went on to write the anonymous letter to the public prosecutor. So as you probably remember from the beginning of the video, when the police arrived at Monnier's house to talk to Louise, the housekeeper had said that she was too ill to receive them. Well, Louise had in fact been quite ill for a long time, and at the time of her arrest, she was already 75 years old and had barely left her bed in 3 months. Normally, Louise went into her daughter's room twice a day, but she hadn't been able to do so for a while. After her arrest, Louise was so poorly that she was brought straight to the hospital, where at first she seemed to be getting better. She was able to eat and be somewhat independent, but on June 6th, her health took a drastic turn to the worse. And the next day, 15 days after her arrest, she passed away. The nurses later reported that she had called for her daughter just before she died. As you can imagine, people wanted to hold Blanche's family accountable for her suffering, and as Louise was no longer alive, the only one who could be held accountable was her brother, Marcel. The trial against him began on October 7, 1901, and lasted a total of 4 days. This was a huge deal in the city of Poitiers and attracted a large crowd outside the courthouse, and I think they were protesting throughout these 4 days. So there isn't that much information about Marcel, but I will tell you what I was able to find. So he was a 53-year-old lawyer who at one time had been a sub-prefect in the Alpes-Maritimes region before moving back to Poitiers to live closer to his family. He had also married, but I didn't find if he had any children. After Marcel's arrest, his staff were questioned, and they described him as a lonely, gentle, naive, and quirky man who had a very weird, in my opinion, pretty disgusting fetish. Marcel was a coprophiliac, which is someone who derives sexual pleasure from feces. The servants told that Marcel would regularly forbid them from cleaning the chamber pots in the home until they were literally brimming with feces. He also thought that it was just fine to bring a full chamber pot, so this bucket full of crap, into the kitchen where the chefs were preparing food. On top of this, he would bring his own chamber pot to his wife's room and left it there next to her bed so that she could also enjoy the smell of his crap. That's so disgusting. Ugh, poor woman. So Marcel's defense was built on claims that he had not known how bad Blanche's situation had been. And I bet you're thinking now, well, didn't he say that he visited his sister's room twice a week? So how could he claim he didn't see or smell anything? Well, he said that he had such bad eyesight that he couldn't even recognize his friends on the street, that everything was just a blur to him. And in addition to this, his sense of smell was also completely gone. And that's why, despite visiting his sister's room every week, he had not seen or smelled anything out of the ordinary. To support this claim, his lawyer told the court that Marcel's friends had actually pranked him once by glazing goat feces with sugar and then feeding it to him, saying that they were strawberries. To be honest, considering what we now know about Marcel, he might have even eaten it willingly without the deception. Marcel also talked about his own relationship with his mother and said that it had been contentious. They had gotten into many arguments over Blanche's treatment and, of course, money. And he claimed that he had tried to persuade his mother to bring Blanche back to the nursing home, but his mother had refused because she didn't want anyone to find out about her mental health issues. At the end of the trial, Marcel was sentenced to 15 months in prison, but only 6 weeks later, the charges were dropped and the sentence reversed. The reason for this was that at the time, the law did not require a bystander who saw or knew of another person in danger to tell the authorities about it. A person could only be convicted if they were actively involved in causing the danger themselves. Although he got off lightly, Marcel's reputation was completely ruined and he was widely despised. He was no longer able to live in the town of Poitiers and had to pack up his stuff and move away. As for Blanche, she lived in a mental hospital for the rest of her life and seemed happy with her new circumstances. She got used to hospital life, but at first she had asked if she could be led back into her beloved little cave, meaning her smelly, dark room at her mother's house. She never complained about cleanliness or her tidy bed and loved the smell of flowers. When she was younger, she had been very interested in different types of flowers and she could name most of them. And at the hospital, she had a habit of collecting bouquets of flowers, and the scent of them brought her great joy and pleasure. Blanche Monnier died in 1913 at the age of 64. And what is interesting, her brother Marcel died the same year. So that's the story of Blanche Monnier, and I have to say that to me, this version of events seems much more plausible. It may not be as dramatic with a clear-cut villain like the other story, but this makes much more sense to me. I'd love to know what you think about this case and which story you believe. But that's all for today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!